Russell, and I am the wife of Charlie Russell, the notorious wife of Charlie Russell. Some called me Robber Nancy because they thought I was robbing their pocketbooks, because when I wanted Charlie to get a fair price for his artwork. Other people called me Robber Nancy because they thought I was robbing them of Charlie's company, because Charlie could tell a lot of stories and he could spend a lot of time sitting in a bar, drinking and having a good time with his friends, instead of working on his artwork. I was known for being his manager. I was his wife and his manager, and I was really his biggest advocate and his biggest fan. I was born in Manville, Kentucky in 1878. My father took off before I was born, so my mama and I lived with my grandparents. My Grandpa Blue, he was a fine man. He'd take me on his knee and tell me all kinds of stories of family history. But my grandma wasn't so fond of me because I was kind of young and not so strong, and there was a tobacco farm and lots of work to be done, so I was an extra mouth to feed most of the time, kind of an annoyance to her. But my grandpa was a great guy, and then when I was 9 years old, first of all, I should tell you, we had a tobacco farm, and I had to pick the worms off the tobacco leaves, and so all that work gave me very little time to go to school. So I really wanted to learn a lot more fancy words and how to conduct myself like a lady, but I didn't get to do all that. I had to work. And when I was 9, my Uncle Tom came to town and saw my mama. She was quite pretty, decided to marry her, and then they moved off to another farm and left me with Grandpa Blue and my grandma. My mother and my Uncle Tom had another child named Ella. When things were okay with my grandparents, despite my grandma's resentment of me, until my grandpa died, but he gave me $250. It was not mine, it was my inheritance. So my Uncle Tom suddenly decided I was okay to have around because I had some money. So he came back and he said, "We're going to Montana. We're going to go and live in Montana and to make our way and to find our fortune." We boarded a train, headed out to Montana, got there, and there wasn't much gold to be had, so Uncle Tom quickly sized up the situation and decided to go to Idaho and find his riches there. So he left Mama and my little sister Ella and me all by ourselves in Helena to find our way on our own. So of course my education got put on the back burner again. I had to help Mama do washing and ironing, and I had to traipse through the streets of Helena with those big clothes baskets delivering all that laundry. And some sewing too. I wasn't very good at it, but I learned. My mom was a great seamstress. I was so-so. Anyway. Then Mama was getting sicker and sicker. She just started getting thinner and thinner, and I tried my best to keep her alive, but she died. And then it was my job to find a casket for her, and I wasn't going to bury her in any pine box, so I had to beg and borrow from the neighbors to find enough to get an oak casket for Mama, get a minister, get Ella all dressed up, and have a funeral. Well, Uncle Tom did come back. When he came back, he just took Ella and left me all by my lonesome in Helena. I was 16 and I didn't have any house, didn't have any family, but I had a nice neighbor who knew of the Roberts family in Cascade, Montana. They had 3 children and they were looking for a nanny. So I begged and was able to convince a freight train driver to take me to Cascade. I got the job. When I was there, Mrs. Roberts was so good to me. She showed me how to set a proper table, taught me how to cook, taught me lots of other fine things about life while I took care of the kids. Mr. Roberts showed me some pictures of some Indians and some cowboys shooting guns, and I thought, who did these pictures? And he said it was his friend who was coming to dinner. I wasn't quite sure I wanted to meet that friend. Oops, we're losing your microphone. I'll just hold it. I wasn't sure I was ready to meet that fellow, so when he walked in, well, you can see what he looked like. He was wearing black pants and a white shirt and a red sash and a Stetson on his head, and he had this chiseled chin and penetrating eyes, and I thought he was pretty handsome. And when he looked at me, he winked, and then I was smitten. And all through dinner we'd exchange glances, and pretty soon he started coming by and taking me for walks along the river, and we had a real nice chat, and we shared our dreams, and we told of what we wanted to accomplish in life. And at one day we were walking by the bridge. It was probably the end of August, early September. He put his hand out and he said, Mamie, because he called me Mamie, not Nancy. He said, Mamie, I'd like you to become my wife. And you know what I did? I ran away, and he painted a little picture, a little watercolor of this for me to remember my reaction when he asked me to marry him. But it's not very honest, because only about 20 seconds later, I turned around and went right back into his arms and said, yes. So we had a wedding at the Roberts house in their parlor, and it was a beautiful wedding. They had a little house they let us live in, just a one-room house. We were cozy, snug as a bug in a rug, but Charlie was having a hard time getting his paintings sold in Cascade because there just wasn't much of a crowd to buy paintings at Cascade. So I told him, Charlie, you know, he thought about going back to being a cowboy. He tried that, and he wasn't bad, but I thought he ought to be an artist because he was exceptional at that. I knew that. So I convinced him to move to Great Falls, and we went to Great Falls. We found a little house on 7th Avenue North. We lived there, and I started helping Charlie sell his work. So a lady ordered a painting, and he asked me to deliver it, and he said, don't you ask for more than $25, Mamie. And I said, I just smiled. Got to the house, and the lady took the painting, and she loved it, and she said, how much is it? And I said, $35, ma'am. And she wrote a check just like that. And when Charlie saw that I had the power to get more money for his paintings, he decided I was the one who should be doing the selling, and he was the one that should be doing the painting. So that's how it was. And I also got him disciplined. Now, we liked that little house on 7th Avenue North, but I really aspired to live in a bigger house and I was really a go-getter, and I wanted to move up in society. So when Charlie Russell's father in St. Louis, he never thought Charlie would last out west. He heard he got married. He came out to see who Charlie had married. And when he met me, he found out, you know, the description was, she's, you know, smart as a tack, she's got a sparkling eye, and she has fainting spells, and the doc had said I wasn't going to last 3 years. But Mr. Russell saw in me a real smart lady, and he knew that Charlie picked the good one. So he gave Charlie his approval. He also told Charlie he had an inheritance coming, so we were able to buy a lot on 4th Avenue North, on which we built that lovely house you can visit in town. I had red flock wallpaper put in the living room, and I had a water closet upstairs. That was a real special thing. And I had a nice kitchen, but my dining room had a problem. It smelled like turpentine, because Charlie used it as a studio, and that just didn't work for me, because I couldn't be a lady of society and have entertaining dinners if I had a turpentine smelling first course, right? So I told Charlie we had to get you a studio. And he said he wouldn't settle for anything except for a log cabin replica of what he'd lived in when he first came to Montana, when he lived at Jake Hoover's place. So I got some telephone poles brought in, a big draft horse cart pulling up 4th Avenue North with all these telephone poles. A neighbor said, what you doing, building a corral in the middle of 4th Avenue North? Charlie felt really embarrassed, and he wasn't going to even set foot in that place. But when it was done, our neighbor came and said, you know, Charlie, I'd like to see what that fireplace looks like on the inside. So he cleverly got Charlie inside. And when he saw it, he could see all the dinners and chances he could cook beans and make coffee for his friends and sit around the fire telling stories, and all the work he could do inside. So he decided it was a fine studio. And from then on, he started being disciplined. I'd make him get up at dawn, and he'd bring me some tea, and then he'd go work all morning, come exactly at noon to have his lunch, take a little nap, and then I said, you can go down to the bar and chat with your friends in the afternoon. You've done your work for the day. And I'd hold up 2 fingers, and I'd say, that means 2 drinks, Charlie. And sometimes Charlie would come back and he'd say, and I'd say, well, Charlie, discipline, you got to be disciplined. I got him to take his artwork out to St. Louis, because that's where his family lived, and they were doing the World's Fair, and Charlie got a painting in the World's Fair, and it was wonderful. People were very excited about his artwork. I knew we had to get all the way to New York, because that's where the galleries and the art buyers were. We did that. We went to New York many times. I got him into an exposition in Canada and in London and in Paris, but Charlie really was most at home in Montana, where he felt comfortable and he could paint what he loved, which was nature and animals and the lifestyle that we're afraid was disappearing. Charlie ended up, he got sick later in life, and when he passed away, I decided I didn't want to stay in Montana, too many memories, so I took our son. We had an adopted son, Jack. We went down to California, where we had a second home we stayed in the wintertime. But I continued to work on Charlie's memory and wrote a book and promoted his art and his lifestyle and communicated with all his friends. Even though there were many people that came after asked me if I'd like to be their wife, I said, no, I am married to Charlie Russell forever, and he and I are necked, as he'd say. We are 2 in 1. And that is my story, and I thank you for listening.
Well, good afternoon. I see some familiar faces here. By the way, are you enjoying the weather here today? Yeah. We brought that down from the Shadow Hills for you, just in case you were wondering. Share a little bit of our nice, cool weather up there with you. Since there are folks here that have heard me talk about a lot of my stories before, I think I'll mix it up and tell you something different today. You've heard stories about me and as a young wrangler over in the Judith, over in that direction, but you probably haven't heard any stories about my career up in the Milk River country, up around the Bear's Paw and around a little town called Chinook, Montana, which I think is still there today. See, back after that horrible winter of 86 and 87, the one where I painted that little picture of that sick cow and so forth, the one they sometimes call the last of the 5,000. Most of the big cattle herds were all wiped out, and a lot of those owners, those companies, they had to start rebuilding their herds. But when they started to go back into the Judith after 87, well, they found some other problems there. There were homesteaders that were starting to move in. There were sheepmen that were coming that way, and they figured they'd probably want to go find some place with some new grass, some better land, and there was. To the north of that, up across the Missouri River, and as I say, on the other side of the Bear's Paw, and up around what you folks, I think, today call the High Line. Well, summer of '89, when I went to do some wrangling work for one of the companies there, they said, Charlie, we're going to start moving these cattle up further north, up to the Milk River country. So the other cowhands and I spent 2 summers doing that. The one year after we were done, some of the other young cowboys like myself, we got together, got us a bunkhouse, and we figured we were going to settle in for the winter up there in Chinook. And they called us the Hungry Seven. Some called us the Lousy Seven. I don't know why, but anyway, we had $175 amongst all 7 of us. And that was to last us the winter. Our bosses didn't even give us a side of beef to have food to eat, so we figured we were going to have to go into business for ourselves in order to make a living, to buy food to put on the table. So we came up with this great idea. We decided to go into the saloon business. Lasted 2 weeks. What booze and liquor we had that we didn't give away to our friends, well, we drank it ourselves. Because I used to say it was kind of like the life of a butterfly. It was very short but very merry. But we still needed to find something to do, and of course we didn't have enough food for the 7 of us. But wouldn't you know, we found out that they had this overpopulation problem with all the chicken coops in Chinook, Montana. And so Kid Price, one of the Hungry 7, and I and the others, we figured, well, we're going to figure out a way to help these good folks up there in Chinook. So we came up with all kinds of ways to get our dinner. One of my favorites was we'd put a fishing hook on a line and we'd throw it out there in one of those chicken coops and wait till one of those hens would come around with its beak and sort of grab onto it, and then we'd snatch that chicken away. Or another time, this was one of our great ideas. We took what whiskey we had left and we threw some of that corn in it, and we threw that corn that was soused in that whiskey to those chickens there, thinking they'd eat it and get drunk and fall over and they wouldn't squawk so much. That idea didn't work out very well. So we had to do things pretty much the traditional way, which was to find one of those coops and snatch as many chickens as we could before the owner found out and came after us. Now, of course, we also had to think of ways to make sure that we didn't get the blame for helping this overpopulation problem. So one of the things we did one time, Kid Price and I were talking with this real nice lady in Chinook, and we had just done a little raid on a chicken coop there, and we'd done what we needed to do and cut off the heads, and we threw the parts and some feathers in the backyard of somebody there, and I think it was the Sky Pilot, it was the preacher there whose yard we threw it into. Well, anyway, we're talking to this lady, and she is so proud of this new preacher that they have in Chinook. And she says, I like him so much that I'm going to invite him over to my house for a chicken dinner. Well, Kid Price and I realized that it was her roosters that we had liberated from a chicken coop. So we didn't want to end up catching the blame for it. So Kid Price right away says, well, you know, I'm real sorry, lady, but I think we saw some chicken parts back there in the yard of that Sky Pilot, that new preacher of yours back there. So we hightailed it out of there. But we found out later that she was worried enough, she sent one of her sons over to the preacher's house, and we heard he came back and said, Ma, them's our chickens back there. We also heard that, can you believe this? That lady never invited that preacher over for a chicken dinner. And we also heard that for some reason that preacher lost a very wonderful member of his congregation over the whole thing. Yeah. Well, you know, there was another time, there was a guy named Kester up there in Chinook, and we filched a couple of chickens out of his coop, almost got caught that time. But we hightailed it back to our bunkhouse. And anyway, I'm frying the chicken up there, and everything's fine, and then there's this knock on the door, real hard and loud. And so I take that frying pan and I stuff it under one of the bunks, and well, sure enough, the door opens up, and who is it but it's Frank O'Neill, the sheriff of Choteau County. And we knew he could hear that grease of frying and the chicken in there that was being cooked up, and probably heard our teeth chattering too, because we all thought we were going to catch hell for this. But instead, old Sheriff O'Neill looks at us and says, well, boys, looks like you got yourself a fine meal planned here tonight. Not planning on joining you or stepping in. He says, what I need is I need two of you fellers to come to Fort Benton with me here and testify in a trial. See, that's a story in itself. See, it was 2 weeks before, Hungry 7, we were all in Graham's Saloon in Chinook. And we were there with a fellow named Jim Wall. We used to call him Sleepy Jim. Now, Jim worked with the same cattle owners that we did, and there was another fellow there by the name of Spencer. And we'd figured out Spencer and Sleepy Jim had a real spat over some horses. And as I said, we were there drinking one night, and in comes Spencer, and he's got a 6-shooter on his side. And he comes up right in front of old Sleepy Jim, and he says, defend yourself. Sleepy Jim says, well, hey, I'm unarmed, and darned if Spencer doesn't pull that 6-shooter out and fires one shot at Sleepy Jim. But he missed him. So then he fires again, and this time he hit old Sleepy Jim in the head. And anyway, you know, Jim falls to the saloon floor, and Spencer runs out of the saloon, and he's got a horse out there, and he just gallops out of town. We heard tell that they didn't find him until about 2 weeks later over in Glasgow. The sheriff of Dawson County managed to get him and bring him back over to Choteau County to O'Neill. So anyway, I said I'd be one of those two folks to testify at this trial. So at that time, you had to go down to Fort Benton, which was some distance, but I went down there and we had this trial. So I'm sitting in the courtroom and I had some paper and some pencils and I started making sketches of things, including things I saw in the courtroom there. See, I bet you folks didn't know I was the first courtroom sketch artist in this country. Except nobody really knows whatever happened to those sketches that I made. I don't remember, and maybe they're lost. Maybe somebody has them in a collection somewhere, and maybe they'll end up in a museum there someday. But well, anyway, you know, poor old Sleepy Jim, he was still alive. So old Spencer, I think he probably thought he was pretty lucky, because if he'd been there on a murder charge and they'd found him guilty, they would have strung him up. In this case, after I was done testifying and the lawyers were done speechifying, the case went to the jury, and well, they were out about 20 minutes and they found Spencer guilty of assault or whatever it was. But I remember the reporter from the River Press came not to talk about so much about the trial, but to talk to me, because I was getting to be kind of famous as an artist, and this reporter wanted to know what I was going to do with my life. And I said, well, I'm actually kind of thinking I'm going to go back to Chinook and open up a saloon up there, despite my prior experiences. Oh, you're probably wondering what happened to old Sleepy Jim and Spencer. Sleepy Jim, he managed to live through all of this, but he was never the same. He was pretty much all crippled up because of that gunshot wound. Now Spencer, he got 7 years in the state penitentiary down in Deer Lodge, except he didn't stay there 7 years. After about 3 years, he asked the governor of Montana for a pardon, which he got, and the reason he got it is he had consumption. And so they figured he wasn't going to live much longer anyway, so better that he be out of prison taking care of himself than the state of Montana taking care of him in Deer Lodge. Well, feels like it's probably going to start to rain again, and we don't want you folks to get wet on this day here today, so I'll just end by saying that Mrs. Russell and I always enjoy this chance when we come back to share a few stories with you, and should you ever make it up our way across the Great Divide, well, there's always a robe spread, and we'll have a pipe lit, and we can always share some stories up there if you don't come back here next year. Y'all have a wonderful afternoon.